Hello and welcome to the Public Health Insight podcast. We will be engaging in interactive discussion of the latest public health issues affecting you and your communities all around the world. My name is Sully, and I am joined by four of my friends.
Ben,
LaShawn,
Gordon,
and Will.
before we move on, it is important to note that the views expressed in this podcast are our own and do not represent any of the organizations we work for or are affiliated with. All right, guys, so we're going to talk about a video that has piqued all of our interest, and it's basically how wildlife trade is linked to the coronavirus. It's by Vox on YouTube, and we're going to be sharing a link to it in the description of this podcast. So high-level summary is that it goes into the background of how these wet markets first originated in China and how the interactions between animals in these wet markets lead to the creation of these new viruses that majority of people are unprepared for. So what did you guys think about it?
So I want to say that for the video, I think I really enjoyed it. I think it provided a pretty comprehensive understanding and just a very high level introduction to COVID. I also think that it did a pretty neutral, unbiased, way of presenting these wet markets. And overall, I think it was very educational. Just to share a bit of my own personal experience. So I've actually been to a couple of these wet markets in places in Asia, and I want to say that these places are very grim. So in the video, it talks about how at these wet markets you can find literally any kind of animal. You can find things ranging from snakes, turtles, all the way up to foxes, ostriches, bats, anything. When you walk into these markets, you're essentially walking into an illegal zoo, where instead of animals that you view for educational purposes, or the animals are there for conservation, these are literally animals that you can pick out and purchase for either consumption or for medicinal purposes. So I just wanted to share a bit about that.
Adding on to that, because in the video it showed the animals were very close proximity to each other, and they were packaged in unhygienic ways, because the video made mention that excrements from different animals were falling on top of each other in the cages. Is that specifically to that wet market, or have you seen that elsewhere as well?
Oh, trust me, these wet markets, they're absolutely rancid. The smell, it's horrible. It's imagine a farm, but in an even smaller space that's often poorly ventilated and whatever, right?
Yeah.
And it's definitely the point about having excrements falling on top of each other, because if you think about it from, I guess, if you were one of these animal traders, the more you stack, the more area, I guess, the less area these crates and stuff take up. So for example, if you can stack six crates of, I don't know, baby deer on top of each other, and you can have 4 of these columns, you have 24 deer rather than having it spread out, right?
Yeah.
So I think just from that perspective, it would make sense for people to just cram as many animals as they can in this confined space.
Yeah, that was a good point. This just kind of reminds me of what I saw in the video, how the government in China, they kind of passed some laws to make it okay to have these markets as a means to get individuals out of poverty.
Yeah. I think so. In the video, it did talk about how originally these markets were used as a means of, I guess,
giving people access to essentially cheaper meat that they wouldn't have to buy.
Yeah, complementing people's diets, right? Because
right.
I think with all of the famines that went on in China in the post Second World War, post Civil War eras, people were literally starving to death, by the millions. And I think these were I think honestly viable options, because if you can't raise traditional farm animals, you can go into the wild, trap something and then bring it here, and then exchange that, and start have something to sustain you and your family, and keep yourself alive.
You do what you got to do.
Yeah.
Definitely.
I think the video was quite telling in the fact that it really showcased how there's a significant interaction between animals, humans, and the environment.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of reminds me about the concept of just One Health, which we learned in our MPH program.
Do you want to share what One Health is, LaShawn, for some of our viewers who might not be familiar with that term?
So I think it's a very multidisciplinary field, I think, but it's basically looking at how the interaction between people, animals, and the environment, and it's looking at how to attain the best optimal health for them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So basically, essentially, human health is animal health and environmental health all at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think the video definitely did a very good job kind of introducing the topic of One Health, or just zoonotic diseases, which are just
Right.
diseases that are of animal origin, right? Because
Right.
it starts off by talking about how our seasonal influenza or other originated from chickens, birds, and pigs, and how
Mm-hmm.
things like HIV was said to originated from chimpanzees.
Mm-hmm.
And in, I guess, a more contemporary context, even the SARS epidemic, or back in 2003, that originated from the civet cat, which was another animal. So it just really,
And is that
sets-
civet cat? That civet cat's also something commonly found in those wet markets?
I would assume so, just because, like I said earlier, these wet markets are essentially like zoos, right? Like any animal, pretty much anything that you can think of, would probably be there, either mature form or in infant form, right?
And it's not just like animals that are native to China, right? It's also some are imported.
Yep.
Yeah.
Because I believe the wet market evolved from a point of trying to combat the famine to more of a luxurious item. I believe the video touched upon the importing of exotic animals like tigers and whatnot, just to
Right.
fulfill those purposes of the more luxurious commodities.
Right.
So, for example, when you have like a tiger's claws, that would be sold at these wet markets as well.
Yeah, no, you're onto something, because what the video was saying is previously these animals that are now in the wildlife trade weren't originally in those wet markets. So now
Yeah.
you're cramming all the animals that you maybe usually sold before, and as well as these new exotic animals all in one place. So then you have zoonosis with viruses jumping around,
Yes.
and
Right.
then
Okay.
and then we know that when a virus mutates from the not the host but the reservoir, the animal reservoir, it can jump to an intermediary animal before infecting humans.
Right.
So the key thing here to note is you give the virus doesn't mutate with a goal in mind. It's random.
Mm.
So when you have like 500 different species of animal in there, there's a higher likelihood that it can jump to a different animal. So
Mhm.
we're in contact with those animals at the wet market, and then
Mm.
you have international travel, globalization. So then things spread within a matter of weeks.
So, Gordon,
Mm.
I was just kind of curious. Like, I was wondering if you could explain to our audience about maybe the transition from the animals to the humans and how it got there. Because I know it maybe passed through a couple of animals before it came to humans. So, can you walk us through that process?
Yeah, for example, as Will mentioned, SARS, and even, or you can say coronaviruses in general, they're usually their animal reservoirs in these cases is a bat. I believe it's usually the horseshoe bat species. So the horseshoe bat, and the unique thing with bats is that they are a good reservoir for viruses because of a unique feature in their bone marrow, which doesn't kill the virus. So what happens is when you have these wet markets, for example, and bats come in contact, or body fluid from these bats come in contact with other animals, the virus would have been mutating while it's in the bat, and now it has an opportunity to change a host. And the important thing here with the intermediary animal is that humans typically don't interact with bats.
Mm.
So what you have here is when it comes closer to something humans are in contact with, either for recreational or for consumption purposes, we're more likely going to be exposed to these new viruses, which then has an opportunity to jump to us and cause infection and spread.
I'm also curious about just some of the backlash that I've been hearing of many xenophobic comments directed towards individuals living in China. What do you think about that? What kind of message would you want to give to our audience?
I think it's important to recognize and remember that the majority of the people in China don't actually eat wild animals. And much like us here in North America or elsewhere around the world, it's farm animals or animals that we would consider, and this is I'm making air quotes here, normal animals, right? And that these people who do consume these wild animals are typically the rich and powerful, which is a small minority of the people living in China or of the population there. So I think this video does a really good job in explaining how people in China, they themselves are victims to these conditions that led to the coronavirus pandemic, and that this virus is affecting many different countries, many different cultures, people of all walks of life, and that this should never be a justification for making xenophobic or racist comments.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Just to add to that, the interesting thing is, trick question, where did the swine flu originate?
North America.
There we go. But no one is saying the North American virus.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So
Exactly.
it's the underlying stigma that these stereotypes that people already have about certain kinds of people that are feeding into this narrative.
Mm-hmm.
So how would we mitigate these kind of unintended consequences? Because these individuals at these markets didn't intend for COVID to come about and cause a pandemic. So, like, for example, we know that temperatures are rising worldwide. We know that this is also resulting in an increase in mosquito populations because of warmer climates. Mm-hmm. And these mosquitoes thrive in these warmer climates, and it causes rapid population growth. And in turn, this causes a greater rate of transmission, which affects human health. Right? So it's just that I really want to know, like, what could we do as a global community to kind of prevent these adverse interactions that may cause these adverse outcomes to humans, the environment, and many animals? It's a tough question, but
yeah,
I think it gets to the root of the One Health interaction that we're talking about.
I think to just to touch on a bit of that question is that the One Health model does provide a sort of policy process to tackle such a situation where there's so many parts moving at play. So, for example, the One Health model is multidisciplinary because you're engaging people who work in the environment sector, like ecologists, wildlife experts. You're engaging people in animal health, veterinarians, agricultural workers. You got human health, doctors, public health practitioners, nurses, and you kind of have to bring them all to the table and figure out, okay, from your perspective and your stakeholder engagement, what can we do? So, for example, I was curious to this, and I looked into what has One Health actually done, because you could just propose a model and it makes sense, but like, what are the actual results coming out of it?
Mm-hmm.
So in China, back in March 2019, so they all came together and they had this great conference and 4-day workshop to address rabies, right? So it was a stepwise approach to rabies elimination in China. They brought all the people that I mentioned, and they were able to concretely say that we are going to look into improving the integration of data on human and animal rabies deaths, implement new approaches to determine how human rabies exposures, and strengthening laboratory diagnostic capacity for suspected animal and rabies cases. So these are objective things that we've been able to do. And I think with the way that COVID has hit the world is, like I said in a previous podcast, it's so unprecedented. We're in a global community now where you can't just let these things slide by. Like, we have to come together, have these conversations, and see what we can do about these wet markets. Because, as Will mentioned, it's only being the usage of these wet markets is by a small minority of affluent people. So why are we suffering on a global scale for these groups of people, right? So I think policy planning has to be put into place once everyone's able to get out of quarantine.
Right. So like Ben and LaShawn alluded to, right? We're talking about One Health, and it's not only COVID-19, right? So for example, you brought up involving veterinarians and the agricultural industry at the table.
Yep.
Right. And the reason for that is because, well, one of the reasons is they use a lot of antibiotics in their practices. Right. So when I'm working on a project now that looks at pharmaceutical disposal and how that affects the environment. So one of the things we found was a lot of antibiotics end up leaching into the environment, right? And I think a lot of people know that this will have effects on wildlife. For example, aquatic animals like fish, there's a drug like birth control, for example, that has estrogen in it, or synthetic estrogen, and it has been linked to the feminization of fish. So we're already seeing the effects of how our behavior influence our environment. But check this. There's also a drug that's an antibiotic, and antibiotics also leach in the environment. And the WHO, I think LaShawn had shared it with us, the top 10 threats to global health, antimicrobial resistance was a top 10.
Yeah, definitely.
And what they're finding is, in some papers I've read, there are in wastewater effluents, so on where the surface water meets land, people have isolated new strains of antimicrobial resistant bacteria because from just those micro trace concentrations in the water. Wow. So then you can say big deal, but then if these strains start to, if humans pick up these strains and get sick and infected with these strains, our natural first line antibiotics won't work. So you can see our behavior influencing the environment, which then influences how we can cope with whatever the world throws at us.
Absolutely.
So it's a very complicated discussion that extends way beyond COVID-19.
Yeah.
Right.
I think COVID-19 is going to be the catalyst to the adoption of this model overall, and how people can start shifting their paradigm to like, where does the virus come from? It's not just it came from randomly out of some animal. It's because we did X, the environment and animals responded with Y, and now we're facing the consequences of it, right?
Yeah, what did Dr. Trick say? That little matrix thing, deep sea, the pressures, deep sea, the pressures, and how we put pressures on the microbe, our environment, and then it affects our health and stuff.
Yeah, let me bring that up right now. Deep sea framework.
The deep sea framework.
Yes.
There's political pressures, social pressures, economic pressures, and then D. I don't remember what the D was.
So the D is the driving force.
Driving force.
P was pressure. S was state. E is exposure, and E is effect. So when you mentioned the economic and the social and the clean, that's our driving force, right? But basically, it kind of relates to the One Health thing, right? Like we're always going to have consequences to what we do. We don't live in some microcosm.
Okay, I'm gonna play a devil's advocate here. Say like we all meet together in like this One Health model where multidisciplinary kind of team is formed. Because if you remember, this whole market developed because of the famine that happened in the 1980s in China. So people's businesses that are related to wildlife will be affected by whatever solution we propose. So what do you guys think about that?
You hit the nail on the head, Sully. I was going to just mention that as well. So the Chinese government actually implemented a ban on all wildlife sales. And as Sully mentioned, like minority of affluent people who have the appetite for these wildlife. And it's often the people of lower socioeconomic status who are doing a lot of the trading. So with this ban, how do you guys think these lower income or lower SCS people will be affected?
Right. Just to be clear, Will.
Yes.
When you're mentioning this ban, is this ban as a result of the recent outbreak of COVID-19?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Oh, didn't know that.
Okay.
So any wildlife trade that happens in China from now on is illegal.
Yeah. I believe so. I heard that after SARS, they had implemented a similar ban during
Right.
SARS, and that was eventually lifted.
Right.
I'm not sure if this one will eventually get lifted as well, but there were maybe 6 to 8 species that the Chinese government considered were okay to eat.
Yeah.
And I guess anything outside of that, those parameters are banned.
Right.
That was a good point, because in the video by Vox, it mentioned that even though in terms of China's revenue, the wildlife market is pretty insignificant in the amount of money that it raises, it mentioned that they had a lot of lobbying power. So it's interesting to see how long that law will stand, and maybe that goes back to your point of why it was kind of lifted after SARS-ish in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I guess just to answer Will and Sully's question, in terms of it fitting in this One Health model and kind of incorporating what Ben said, he mentioned that you really have to bring all stakeholders on the table from different disciplines. And it's not just bringing them together, I think. It's about having intentional dialogue. So including individuals that are directly affected from any sort of ban. And I think it's important for people in power to make sure that they include individuals that are definitely going to be affected by this, and together, collaboratively, find a solution.
Yeah, because for the people who are affected, wildlife is their business, and they're typically poor people. You gotta find some other opportunities for them if like a ban on this scale happens.
Right. And that's a great point, because guess what? You remember what we learned in class about Ebola and how it linked to the deep sea thing?
Yeah.
The political pressures and economic pressures pushed people out into the forest
To get that bush
and
meat.
they started interacting with maybe animals that they wouldn't ordinarily interact with in the case of Ebola. And what you had was, long story short, you had bats eating mangoes, and then gorillas eating the contaminated mangoes, and then people who were looking for food, they were pursuing bushmeat, and the easiest bushmeat to get were the gorillas that were sick. So then that kind of perpetuated the spread of Ebola as well.
And an interesting thing to say is that even if you do, create a ban, right? Who's going to actually enforce that? So these individuals, like, sure, there's a ban, but like they could obviously just go out into the wilds and grab whatever food they do need to eat.
It will just move to the black market.
Exactly.
Right,
There's already
which generates more money, right?
Exactly. There's already an illegal black market that exists.
And the black market is often poorly regulated, so you're actually putting yourself at even a higher risk, of improper inspections and things like that nature.
So do you think the solution then is to more in the sense of like the regulation of cannabis, is that have government influence to structure it a lot better, where you're not having situations or environments current to like that are similar to current wet markets, don't have animals stacked on top of each other.
Right.
You have more regulations, more restrictions, make it more legit, for lack of a better word.
So kind of like animal rights.
Exactly.
Yeah, it would make sense, but I think we have to consider that the ban was implemented in China.
Yeah.
And as you guys know, with the Chinese political structure, it's very little collective consulting. I'll say that. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
And remember, you can record a podcast without everyone sitting at the same table, which is what we're doing, by the way, if that wasn't clear. Okay, bye.
Remember, public health is a field of inquiry and an arena for action to improve lives one population at a time. This has been the Public Health Insight podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please drop us a like and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or your podcast platform of choice. You can also send us your questions, comments, and suggestions for discussion topics at thepublichealthinsight@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.